community, it's still. Okay, great. So now the recording is happening. And so for people who may be watching this, we have recording issues. And so now I'm still at the beginning of the presentation, just talking about my language journey a little bit. Um, so fast forward, I didn't really connect with the language until my college years, both personally and connecting with actual speakers of the language. And that's unfortunate because I took 3 years of it in high school, but I didn't really um, see it as a community language until I got to college. And so I knew that when I became an educator, I did not want that experience for my students. So that's kind of where my interest in social justice came from. I knew that language learning can be a unifying and empowering experience at all levels, beginning in level one, all the way through AP and the advanced courses, even in high school classes, and even in those introductory college courses, because it wasn't until I started studying like literature and culture classes that I really changed my perspective on Spanish as a language. And so that's kind of the perspective that I took. This is my first year teaching. Um, Way back in 2003, I believe that was when I started teaching high school. I'm in the yellow shirt there. And my roles in higher education have involved pre-K through 12 Spanish and ESL teacher preparation, um, and also being a Spanish and education professor for various levels, undergraduate and graduate. So this first picture in the upper right-hand corner is from my time at University of North Carolina, Wilmington. And then this bottom picture, this is my first class that I taught at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I've been here a year now, and the course was on abolitionist and liberationist language pedagogies, which kind of fast forwarding a little bit to the discussion, I think it's exciting that we're building upon justice-centered and justice-oriented pedagogies in very radical ways. And so that excites me, the direction that the profession is heading in. So again, continue with my own perspective, my lens, I kind of focus on curricular justice, linguistic justice, and racial justice. I think that our curriculum reveals what we value, what we fundamentally believe that language learning entails, and it dictates what we teach. So I think that's important. I focus on linguistic justice because, we're all language teachers and we know that this is important. And I'm always thinking about how language can be a tool for liberation. Historically and presently, in many contexts, language is often a weapon of oppression. It's a political and social construct that's sort of deeply embedded in our institutions and ideologies and throughout history. And we still see legacies of that today. Language has been used to oppress certain groups and empower other groups. So, for example, we used to connect being able to vote to being literate. So we used to tie specific rights to language. And even in our classrooms today, anyone who, if you're like me and you've done research on heritage language speakers and mixed classes where you have heritage speakers with L2 speakers and learners, you see some of those ideologies perpetuated in the way that we approach the varieties of language that different folks speak as a community variety of Spanish. And then obviously racial justice. Racial justice is important because I think racial justice movements have been the impetus for other justice movements to follow. And race is something that intersects with other identities and often informs several justice-oriented initiatives and movements. And there are intersections of race when we talk about gender equity, wealth equity, immigrant rights, indigenous rights, environmental justice, pretty much everything, but that's just to name a few. And I I know no one in this group thinks this, but I sometimes get pushback. Well, race isn't really a big issue in the language that I teach or the communities that I engage with. And so I think that's kind of taking it too far to have this focus on racial justice in the language classroom. And my response to that is to say, just Google racism and then insert whatever community you want to insert there. And I guarantee you that you'll see communities in that area that you put in that place, racism or race and whatever, you'll see communities that are engaged in activism for racial justice, without fail, all over the world in some way. So I gave that background because I think our perspectives matter. Back in 2021, I was able to participate in a Fulbright Hayes seminar in Mexico. And while we were there, we were all looking at ways to incorporate Afro Mexican histories, cultures, languages, experiences, identities in the work that we were doing in our own context. So we were all higher ed professionals. There may be like 10 or 12 of us. And we were there for a couple of months, I believe. And we all looked at this idea of race and blackness in Mexico and how it applied to our individual context. And we all developed these curricular projects. So you had people who were language professors, like Spanish professors like me. You had people who were maybe art or history, English language arts, creative writing, those fields. And you also had a couple of administrators. The quote you see on this slide was from someone who gave me permission to share it. And this person, like many of our students, kind of took a few Spanish classes in college, not fluent in it by any means, just basic proficiency. And that's the reality for most of our students, right? And at the end, when we were all reflecting on our experiences, this person said that I'm pretty pissed off that I didn't learn about Afro-Mexican identities and cultures in my Spanish classes. Now, whose fault is that? And I remember when she said that, I related to the part about being pissed off because that was kind of my experience. Like, oh my gosh, this is, especially when you actually go there and you see how deeply embedded these various Black and Indigenous identities are in these cultures. And if that wasn't your experience taking the language, it does feel like you were robbed a little bit. And then the part also that stood out to me is, whose fault is that? We're talking about systemic issues. And so I know that there's only so much that an individual can do, but I do encourage us to reflect on, to the extent that it depends on us, what can we do so that we're not in a position where we can say, oh, it's my fault that I didn't do this, or that I didn't give my students this experience, because we do have some control. And then we also have different backgrounds that we bring to this work. We approach this work with our own biases and our own experiences. And I want us to consider how those elements might be an asset for engaging in this work rather than a challenge. I love this quote by Uju Anya. This wasn't even the main idea of her article, but it's just a kind of a throwaway line at the beginning that stood out to me. And she talks about her eagerness to remedy, in this particular article, she is writing about underrepresentation of Black people. It comes from experiencing this firsthand. And so that's kind of where my passion and also my focus on race and Blackness comes from as well, just my own underrepresentation. And so that's why it's important when you're thinking about hiring, when you're thinking about who teaches different classes, to have people from different experiences, different perspectives, different backgrounds teach these courses, because we all approach it from a different way and we all have our own strengths and challenges that we bring to it. I love when Gloria Latson-Billings is talking about culturally relevant pedagogy. She says, we teach what we value. And Sammy and Eileen, they expand on that in culturally sustaining pedagogies. We sustain what we love. And so the question then becomes, in our teaching, what does our syllabus indicate about what we value, what we choose to sustain, what we love? What does the content of our courses indicate about that? So this presentation is about social justice, and I often struggle with how and if to define it because I think it's just such a broad term, and it's difficult to come to one prescriptive definition, and actually don't recommend that at all. I think it's best to think of it as a highly contextualized term with a fluid definition rather than a checklist. And so it means different things in different contexts to different people. But I think for the purposes of this presentation, we can sort of agree that it relates generally to the equitable distribution of power, tangible and intangible resources. And I like to think about it in terms of mattering as well. Um, and what we're saying with that is to our students, you're valued enough, literally and figuratively, literally in terms of like your actual body, also in the content that we choose to center in our classrooms. You're valued enough to be important and to be heard as well. Um, Social justice sort of borrows from or plays nice with intersections that we find in other critical theories. Um, I will try to give just like a one sentence thing about each of these. So intercultural, starting at the top there with intercultural communicative competence, the ability to understand cultures other than one's own and to use that understanding to communicate effectively. So obviously there are implications for social justice there. Critical pedagogies, my colleague Stacey Margarita Johnson and I, we describe that as any classroom practice that sort of addresses difference, power, or social stratification in the classroom or in the world. And then a subcategory of that in education might be critical race theory, where we look at intersections of race, power, and policy in a society. Culturally responsive pedagogies, Gloria Latson-Billings highlights sort of three important elements of that. Number one, we focus on student learning. We think about cultural competence. And so that's a word that we language educators are very familiar with, cultural competence, that phrase. And then increasing student socio-political and critical consciousness. Culturally sustaining pedagogies talk about not just acknowledging and accepting cultures, but explicitly embedding and centering them in the curriculum using social justice frameworks. Multiculturalism, from Sonia Nieto in her definition, she talks about including things of affirmation, solidarity, and critique in the context of diverse perspectives. There are also connections to queer theory, the critique of socially constructed notions of gender and sexuality. And for example, this is very relevant in the language classroom when we think about terms like Latinx, or singular they in English. I dare you to go to Twitter or X or whatever it's called and search for those words. Whenever I see Latinx trending, I already know I don't want to click on it. I don't want to see the ugliness that people are going to say and the resistance that people have to that term. But even the languages that we teach are gendered. You think about a language like Spanish, la pared versus el suelo. Why is wall feminine where floor is masculine? Like sometimes it's completely arbitrary, but sometimes there are implications. For example, a word like pilot, which traditionally didn't have a feminine form, or a word like victim in Spanish, which is always used in the feminine form. Ratiolinguistics, very broadly thinking about intersections of race and language identity. And again, I know that's very broad and very simplified, but just want to make sure that everyone is kind of seeing where I'm coming from with each of these terms. Jack Mesereau's transformative learning, which is sort of this constructivist theory in which students engage in critical reflection and they reinterpret and transform their own perspectives. Anti-racist pedagogy, I think of that as sort of combating the erasure, the violence, the marginalization, discrimination of minoritized groups. And in addition to that, uplifting and celebrating the liberation efforts of those communities. And finally, anti-colonial pedagogies, combating, in the case of Spanish anyway, combating Eurocentric and colonial ideologies that set the status quo for the way that we think about Spanish and the way that we teach Spanish. So I do have a description of what I think justice-centered language learning looks like in the classroom. I think that it's inherently political. It's intentionally anti-racist and anti-colonial. It not just incorporates, but centers historically and presently marginalized groups. It allows students to take sort of a critical, intersectional, messy approach to the study of languages, cultures, and communities. So everything is not going to fit neatly into a Venn diagram. And it's collaborative and builds community and requires self-reflection and humility from the educator as well as the learner. I do have a couple of endorsements courtesy of Twitter or X. And this is just to show you that, number one, I do believe that social justice and language education are inextricably linked. And I know that there's pushback from that. And I understand that we do get pushback from that. And I'm often on the receiving end of some of that pushback from people who are flat out against it or don't fully understand it. So I did want to sort of encourage you to persist even when you do get some of the pushback that you see from folks. Like this person said to me, what can you expect from a man whose job is to teach languages but thinks his job is teaching social justice while teaching languages? Which is true. I mean, I don't think that's that's an insult in the way that the person intended it. And then another person in on my thread said, language teachers should help students learn languages and not take advantage of having captive listeners upon whom to impose the teacher's ideas of social justice. And that's just a misunderstanding of what social justice is. It's not sort of filling up students' brains with my own ideas. That's a very banking approach to teaching, and that's totally not what I'm doing now. If anything, I want students to learn to be critical thinkers, and to create context for that critical thinking to happen in the classroom. Um, One person in the chat said it would be interesting to ask those folks what their idea of teaching and learning languages is. And yeah, if it was a colleague that I cared about and someone who I really considered that I wanted to engage and make the profession better with, then I would engage in those conversations. But like the randos on Twitter, I don't really respond to them to protect my own peace of mind there. So I think part of the reason for that pushback is that traditionally and even currently, we think of language learning in within frameworks of marketplace ideologies, where it's important to learn a language because you'll get a good job or you'll be able to compete in the global market. And the problem with that, there are two things. First of all, that doesn't represent the majority of our students' experiences in the language classroom. I have a number here, less than 1%. That's if you take out English, that's the number of folks who start studying a language in a US school who then become fluent in that language. And so that's the reality for our students. About 99% of whatever institution that you're at, they're not going to go on to become fluent in a language that they study, unless they really need to major in it or at least minor in it and have sort of immersive experiences. And we know all of that. And most colleges only require a couple, like 2 to 3 semesters at most, or not at all in some cases, of language study. And so we really have to think about, what do we really want our students to learn in the class? And let's say they do become fluent in the language or they do recognize the importance of it. It's still problematic because here is something that went viral a couple of years ago. This is a guy who's in a deli in New York, and he just goes off on this racist tirade when he sees people speaking in Spanish at this deli. And if you look up who this person is, he's a lawyer in New York. So you would kind of assume some level of social consciousness there. And not only that, but their law office also advertises the fact that they are a multilingual law office. So this is someone who gets the marketplace ideology aspect of it, but doesn't really understand the empathy piece of it, or really the reality of how languages are actually used when you go out in public. So we don't want our students to end up there, right? I love this quote from Jonathan Rosa. He talks about how there have always been awful multilingual people, and we have to think about multilingualism in service of what? Just learning another language or majoring in a language or experiencing another culture or another language doesn't automatically make you a better person. So we really have to think about multilingualism in terms of how it's connected to broader political struggles as we think about our instruction. And the ultimate question is, why do we teach and learn languages, and who do we really want our students to be? For some of our students, yeah, they want to use that language to compete in the global market. So their ideas of capitalism and competition, they may even travel. But again, this is some of our students. This doesn't reflect the reality of all of our students, or even most. So some may engage in study abroad travel, leisure travel, or travel in the name of quote unquote service. Even fluency is for some the way that we approach language education in the US and the way that most higher ed students engage in language. The reality is that most of those students aren't going to become fluent in the language that they study at the university. And I think that's a tough reality for us because we want there to be a multilingual society, but we know that that's not the reality for most of our students. And so what is the reality for all of our students? I think if we focus on themes of global citizenship that are grounded in justice-centered pedagogies, everyone can get something out of that. So we focus on themes of liberation, empowerment, justice, empathy, and community building. And then perspective transformation. Thinking, not limiting the power of what a language class can be. Language classes can shift students' perspectives. And I don't need to show you feedback from my students for you to understand that, because I know that we all have stories of how students' perspectives have literally been shifted via language study. And so I think it's important for us to remember that and to focus on that. So why is this an uphill battle? I would imagine that all of you are kind of on board with what I'm saying. I don't think I'm saying anything now where you're like, oh, that sounds horrible. Empathy, community, don't want to do that. So why is it such a challenge then for us to have language classes that are really centered in justice-oriented values and pedagogies? Well, historically, we have a tradition of exclusion and erasure. And I saw one of the authors, Beth, is actually with us today from one of the people whom I cite for this. But a tradition of excluding our students in opportunities like study abroad, like language study in general. Exclusion of educators. If you look at the identity of language educators and the retention rate of language educators, exclusion in curriculum, what we highlight, what's readily available in the resources that we use, the most popular resources like textbooks and etc. Opportunities. And even in research, there's not a lot, it's still an emerging field, this idea of social justice and related topics in language education. So there's even exclusion there. It's interesting because we as a language profession, yes, we know that communication is important, right? However, we also identify things like cultures, connections, comparisons, communities. So we know and we kind of agree as a profession that language education is not just about communication. It's not just about the linguistic features of the language. All of these elements are involved. But the issue is this number, 0. So if you take that thick ACTFL World Readiness Standards document or book, really. And I'm not talking about just the description of the standards. I'm talking about the standards with all of the examples in all of the languages that they have. So I searched through this entire document, and 0 is the number of times that you'll see race, that you'll see sexuality, that you'll see gender, unless you're talking about language gender, like gender of nouns and adjectives, etc., that you'll see discrimination, that you'll see equality or equity or even justice, 0. However, you will see terms like culture and diversity a lot. We like those safe terms that really can be expanded to mean nothing. But this is to show that even the most ubiquitous, the most popular, and most widely used language framework, the World Readiness Standards in K through 12 and higher ed education, is not written from a justice-centered perspective. And so that's problematic, right? Because that means that, okay, we have to really be intentional. We can use this framework. I think those things are good categories. Cultures, community. I talk a lot about community building, for example. I think all those things are great, but if we're not intentional and we just sort of take things at face value, we're going to miss that social justice piece. And this is something that we struggled with for decades in our profession. This is going back to the 80s, talking about how multicultural materials deal with cultural distinctiveness. We don't really want to look at ugly realities of things like systemic discrimination. We want to focus on clothing, toys, and food, and things like that. However, responding to racist attacks and defamation is also part of that quote unquote target culture that we are learning in our classes. Fast forward to the 90s, it's easier to deal with something like Oktoberfest or Cinco de Mayo, whatever you want to put in there, than to explore the emergence of something like xenophobia and explore parallel patterns in the United States. And then fast forward to something more contemporary. We don't get our hands too dirty. We don't want to talk about stories of escaping war and finding refuge and racism in the new land. And this impacts the way that students think about language learning as well. For example, these are some quotes from students who went through a Justice-centered Spanish curriculum. So this first student says, topics regarding things such as LGBTQ have nothing to do with Spanish culture, and they would have rather learned about food, dances, architecture, etc. And these are higher ed students, and I don't blame the students. When I put these quotes up, I'm not trying to attack the students. I'm just showing the results of what happens when students have certain expectations of what language learning should be based on their experiences. As if LGBTQ folks don't exist in Spanish-speaking communities, right? This person said that many of the assignments were good assignments for a politics or history course, but did not relate to the Spanish language, as if politics and history are removed from the study of Spanish. And then finally, this one says, there were times I felt like I was in a social justice class rather than a Spanish class. And I thought that use of the term rather than was interesting, as if those two are mutually exclusive. So you can't have both. It's either a social justice class or a Spanish class. And then this is the result. Some students may leave foreign language study with the impression that learning a foreign language entails only how to communicate basic personal needs or facts, and it leaves out entirely the socio-political dimensions in which language and culture are intrinsically embedded. So I want to spend the next few minutes looking at some interdisciplinary frameworks and some ideas of what this actually looks like in the classroom. So moving a little bit away from the theory and the background and really seeing, okay, what are some frameworks that we can apply in our own context? So there are two interdisciplinary frameworks that I want to highlight. I think Spanish and I keep saying Spanish because that's what I teach, but I mean, really world languages in general. I think we can learn a lot from other disciplines who have done some work in incorporating justice-centered pedagogies in those disciplines, in addition to the field of TESOL, which I think has, at least in terms of publications, is a little bit more advanced in terms of thinking about these issues in that context. So one resource that I want to highlight are the social justice standards from Learning for Justice. So identity, thinking about how we make sense of our individual and collective identities. And I think in the language classroom, we might help students communicate and reflect on how they and others negotiate linguistic, cultural, and community identities in a variety of contexts. Diversity, thinking about diversity as an asset for building empathy, respect, understanding, and communication. And I think that will help us, that framework will help us to move away from this sort of superficial facts-based understanding of diversity and focus on more of those complex, nuanced social, cultural, political, and historical implications. Justice, looking at our critical consciousness with regard to things of power, privilege, stereotypes, and bias at the individual and institutional level, and doing that in the language classroom. And then action. How might we plan, implement, and evaluate appropriate justice-oriented action steps? And I also want to mention action does not mean that students have to develop solutions, quote unquote, solutions to issues or problems that you might examine in the classroom. That's a very sort of savior-oriented approach. I guarantee you, if you study any type of oppression, there are people who are part of that community who are already engaged in their own liberation. And so I'm helping my students identify and aligning themselves with justice-oriented movements that are already being led by minoritized and marginalized members of the communities and cultures that we may be studying. And then I like Gholdy Muhammad's culturally and historically responsive literacy model. So I have here how I think each of these 5 elements might apply in a language classroom specifically. So identity, helping students make sense of who they and others are. Skills, highlighting proficiency. Again, I think proficiency is important. Some of the pushback that I often get is, well, you know, students can't do this in the quote unquote target language or the language being studied, and I'm going to have to use English all the time. And that's not the case. I think I think social justice and proficiency are mutual goals and sort of inextricably linked together. Intellect, the new and interesting knowledge that students will acquire. That critical piece, how will students recognize and understand various themes of power, equity, and anti-oppression? And then joy, how will students celebrate the joy and beauty of themselves and others? And I have an example of what that might look like. This is a very brief reading in English, but it's also available in Spanish if folks are interested in that. But I know that we have a multilingual group here today. So I'll give you, well, I'll read it because I'm not sure how big your screen is or how you're able to look at this. I usually don't like reading presentations, but I'm not sure if you can see it in the same way that I can see it. So this is a person talking who identifies as Blaxican, talking about her identity. She says, my dad is Black, my mom is Mexican. She's from Guadalajara, Jalisco. I grew up with more Mexican influences because my father's family didn't live in California. So I had to learn how to be Black when I got older. I love being defined as Blaxican because it's important to recognize my dual identity. Often you're forced to prove who you are, and so defining myself as Blaxican allows me to explain to people that I'm more than one race. And again, this is a term that folks use to describe themselves. And if you click on the link there, you'll see many descriptions in addition to the woman that you see here. And they vary widely in the way that they think about their Black identity, which I think is good because it combats stereotypes. To see people from relatively the same community have these very sort of, in some ways contradictory, to be honest, views of what Blackness is, it's good for students to see. Because you know, these folks, their identities are complicated and they're not monolithic. So going back to Gholdy Muhammad's framework, some questions that I would then create or that would guide my thinking about this in the classroom would be, how might this text help students better understand their own identities, focusing on that identity piece. Skills, how can I use this text to engage my students in interpretive, interpersonal, and presentational communication, using vocabulary and language functions that they would be learning anyway? Like, I'm thinking about adjectives to describe yourself. I'm thinking about nationalities, family, that kind of thing. How might students come to a deeper understanding of race? That's the intellect piece. Criticality, how can students engage critically? And here is when I sometimes will incorporate L1 activities, or I will encourage students who are multilingual to engage in translanguaging. I encourage that in the classroom. And that can be done outside of class via discussion board if you don't want, if you're very limited in the time that you have with students in the actual classroom. But there, or you can sort of have a discussion at the end of the lesson where you unpack some of these themes with students in class, because I do think that's important for students to be able to sort of have that experience and not be frustrated by always being stuck at the novice level, because they're not thinking at the novice level, right? And so their proficiency in the language. We don't want that to limit the perspective transformation that might happen. And by the way, this is something that can be done in a novice level classroom. And then how is this text an example of resistance, liberation, and or joy? Everything, social justice doesn't mean that everything is going to be doom and gloom. Actually, when people from those communities are writing about their own experiences or producing any type of art, like music or visual art, dance, whatever, about their experiences, there's usually a focus on resistance and liberation and joy. And I think that if we use resources that are written by the majority identity, that's where we see those narratives of oppression and victimhood. But folks aren't usually talking about themselves in that way. And it's good for our students to see that. And speaking about what people are talking about, I recommend let the text speak for themselves. I don't feel like I'm bringing in a specific agenda when I include these resources and these perspectives into the classroom. I kind of let the person speak for themselves. So with something like this, if you're like, well, I'm not Blaxican, I'm not Black or Mexican or any of that, like I don't relate to any of this at all, how can I possibly teach my students about this? And I would just say, take that onus off of yourself. You're not teaching your students about this particular thing. The person who produced it is teaching them the content, right? We're just helping our students engage with it and creating frameworks for them to engage in it in a way that supports their language learning and also their criticality. Another element that we might want to think about are points of entry. So these are some common contexts that I identify when I went through a Spanish, French, and German level 1 and 2 book. So the kind of the vocabulary list that you'll see in text, this is what I saw. And so I'll give you a second to look at that and see some of the themes there: identity, shopping, home life, literature, pastimes, etc. And then these are some justice-centered themes that I think we can combine with those other themes in order to create justice-centered lessons in our classrooms. So again, I'll just leave this up for a second so that you can see a couple of those. And like I mentioned, you will all have access to the presentation afterwards. And so what does that look like? So let's take something like sports, which is on our list here. That was in all of the textbooks to some extent, students learning to talk about sports. And so how can we use that as a point of entry so that we're not talking about something superficial, but we are using that same vocabulary that students are otherwise learning, those same language functions, and we're approaching it in a more critical way, a more justice-centered way. So this is a tweet from Naomi Osaka, who is a famous tennis player. She's Black, Japanese American. And I love things like Twitter or X, whatever you want to call it, Instagram, TikTok, because the language is so limited that you can usually give students the support that they need, even if it is beyond their proficiency level. So I love things like that, where sort of inherently the amount of input is limited. So she talks about, before I'm an athlete, I'm a Black woman. Watching the continued genocide of Black people at the hand of the police is honestly making me sick to my stomach. And so I work with this Japanese teacher to develop a unit talking about how athletes engage in activism based on their identities and their experiences. And so that became a much deeper unit of study for the students, and they engage with it much more. And they also learned about perspectives that maybe they had not considered previously. I'm not used to talking for an extended period of time. I need to get back into it. So good thing I have a water here. If you teach about entertainment, you can look at counter narratives from, in this case, these are all Black Latinx actors. And I'll just highlight a couple things here. Jenna Torres on the left talks about she quickly realized that the world liked their Latinas to look Italian and not like her. Lauren Velez talks about how she couldn't even get a role as a Latina because people didn't, if they thought about what a Latina was, an image of her didn't come to mind. And so she struggled to get that. And then John Leguizamo talks about how he had to do his own projects in order to combat what he calls the Hollywoodedness of it all. And that's the definition of a counter narrative, right? Creating your own story because otherwise your story wouldn't be told. And again, very simplified input. I have here the version that's in English so that everyone can understand it, but you can put this in another language if you want to. And then have students to create their own blurbs like this. When we're learning how to narrate in the past, I have students do this. Talk about a time when something about your own identity was misinterpreted or was difficult for you, or just a time that you saw it in someone else's life if you don't want to share about your own life. And then we put those in a digital poster board, so like a Padlet or something, so that students can read and interact with what other folks have put. If you're doing employment, you can link that to advocacy. This was in collaboration with a German professor. We looked at, during the COVID shutdown, how Germany banned prostitution and how that made it unsafe for folks who were engaged in that profession, and what types of advocacy people who were part of that profession engaged with, and how students might want to align with that, or what parallels they saw or they see in other cultures. I guarantee you, if you look in a textbook, you're not going to see prostitution as an employment, as a employment profession on the vocabulary list. But that identity is out there, and those people are out there, and it's important for their stories to be told as well. And that's a place that we can do it. I recognize that we all teach in different instructional contexts. So I know that some of us may be in contexts where you have prescribed lessons. I've seen that in higher ed, where everybody has to teach the same thing on the same day. Some of us maybe don't have prescribed lessons, but have prescribed curriculum materials. And I've seen that where everyone has to use the same textbook. And I was at a university like that when I taught sort of the first few semesters of Spanish. Everyone had to use the same textbooks. Students had to buy it, and the textbook was mad expensive. And so I would feel guilty if I didn't, even if I didn't agree with the textbook. I felt like I have to use it. As students are spending over $200 to buy this book, like I'm going to make sure that it's a huge part of the class, because that's not fair for the students. And some of us may have curricular freedom where you can, do whatever you want in your classroom. And I put freedom in quotation marks because we're still bound by the policies of the institution, which are often colonial and racist. And so, none of us is completely free. And so really quickly, I want to show you how I use the textbook to create more engaging essential questions, and how I move away from that sort of grammatical organization of the way that many textbooks you'll see are done. And I try to think more broadly in terms of essential questions that I think might be interesting to students, and that might inform the way that I then go about teaching the class. And so you can see here, this is the textbook that I used when I taught those first 4 semesters of Spanish. So you can see here how it's organized by in context, which are like the vocabulary list. And then at the end there, you'll see structure. Those are the grammatical structures that students are learning. And so for this one, I took something like nature and the environment, which was one of the units in the book. And I think a good essential question is, how do we interact with nature? I think that's interesting, and that might spark some good ideas for some activities. It's not inherently justice oriented, though, or justice centered. And so that's the problem there. So I can't just stop with that question. I have to think, how can students engage in critical thinking and reflection? And how can I link my question to one or more of the social justice domains that we talked about earlier? And so that led me to create this essential question to guide all of the activities that I did with that unit. What are the responsibilities of individuals and societies with regard to access to natural resources? And just for your reference, in case you're interested, I have all 4 of the essential questions that I came up with for that book. We had to quote unquote cover lessons 1 through 6. And so I went through those lessons and I said, okay, by the end, kind of globally, what should my students be able to do with the language? How can I organize that in a way that makes sense? And that's not just, moving from grammar topic to grammar topic. And then what are some essential questions that can then guide my lesson planning? And you can see here my essential questions, the context, the language functions, the summative assessment that went with each unit, and then how I cross-referenced that with the textbook in case people had questions about that. And in addition to the summative assessments that we create, I encourage students to engage in self-assessment. And I think that's important in the justice-centered classroom. And this can be students talking about how well they can do some of the language functions that we want them to do, which are those first 4 bullet points there: participating in conversations relating to the nature and the environment, using ojalake to express wishes and hopes. And then if you look at the last question there, this is kind of the justice-centered element of this lesson, and where all of the conversations centered around the resources that I selected for it. We looked at Hurricane Maria and the aftermath in Puerto Rico and the advocacy that certain communities engaged in. And I specifically focused on the community of Louisa, which was hit pretty badly by Hurricane Maria. And it's also one of the Blackest and unfortunately also one of the poorest regions in Puerto Rico. And so I wanted my students to describe and discuss implications of race, identity, and community relating to Hurricane Maria, how even something like a hurricane, there's race that plays into that, and different communities who are racialized in different ways experience even something like a national disaster in different ways because of racism. And then we look at relevant advocacy initiatives, and I focused on advocacy done by community leaders in that actual community. And you can see here I have here, they can do this in English because that's mainly what I wanted them to be able to do. Like a lot of our deep discussions were in English. And again, most of that took place on discussion boards and to a limited degree in Spanish. Given their proficiency level, I also developed ways that they could talk about some of these critical topics in the target language as well. And then after every unit, I ask my students to talk about the activities or content that they found to be most interesting. Did they interact with anything that changed their thinking? And do they have any feedback for me? And I love having students do this because it sparks so many great discussions, and I learned so much more about my students. One of my favorite things about doing something like this, I didn't include it in this presentation, even though the person did give me permission to share it, but a white woman in my class talked about how looking at Nicolas Guillen's poetry and the way that we talked about and the way we linked it to contemporary issues on race helped her to better understand the perspectives and the experiences of her Black stepson, right? So just looking at that person's identity in the class, I wouldn't know that they had a Black stepson that they were trying to raise and that they were struggling with understanding how that student saw race. And I think it's so cool and powerful that something that we did in Spanish class can be helpful in that context. So even if this person doesn't go on to become fluent in Spanish, which they probably didn't, they stopped at the 3rd semester. Even if they don't go on to become Spanish, that's something that's going to be meaningful and impactful for them for their entire lives. And it's something that they learn in a Spanish class. I did say that I want to make sure that I leave appropriate time for discussions. And so I'm not going to go through these final slides. I think they are pretty self-explanatory and they stand on their own pretty well. So I have here some everyday steps that we can take. Most important one here is that last one. Make sure that we ourselves are engaging in face-to-face and virtual communities that are diverse and that speak to the minoritized experiences of the cultures that we're teaching about in our classes. I have here a sample syllabus statement that I use in my Spanish class in order to help students understand why my class is going to maybe be different from ways that they studied Spanish in the past, and that's here for your reference. And then these are some of the goals that I have with that syllabus statement. I have a few ongoing strategies. I'll just talk about one here. The final one there, set realistic expectations for justice-oriented outcomes. I think that's important. Helping students understand we're not solving these issues. That's not our goal. It's not even something that we can do. But we are just shifting the pendulum and increasing our awareness and our understanding. And also in many ways, if there are local communities engaged in these issues, I try to make connections for my students who might be wondering, is there something I can do? And I tell them, well, you probably don't need to create anything. You probably just need to identify ways that people are already engaged in this work and align yourself to that work. And the thing I want to talk about here with engagement is the final piece, proactive planning. I think just as an educator, thinking ahead and imagining what are all the ways that this conversation might go off track, or what are some ways that students may intentionally or unintentionally, I always try to give them the benefit of the doubt, unintentionally we'll say, try to derail the conversation, because that sometimes happens. And it's just important to think about that because it helps to frame the types of questions that I ask. And making sure that I don't ask questions where a possible answer could be discriminatory. Asking how questions or why questions versus do you agree with questions, that type of thing. And just also imagining how I'm going to respond if a student says something that may not be appropriate. And I think that the community building piece is so important, because if students have those relationships, there's room for forgiveness if someone says something or writes something in a discussion post that in other contexts might be interpreted the wrong way. And finally, I talked about a lot here, but I just recommend starting small and moving from there. And you don't have to burn everything down and start from scratch. Then that's one approach, I guess. But you're probably going to burn yourself out and become discouraged in that process. I think it's much easier to start small and look for those points of entry in your curriculum and go from there. I also have here links to additional resources that you can click on, and you can click on the images to learn more. And one resource that I realized I do not have here, and I cited it throughout, I'm so sorry for my oversight, Beth, is ACTFL's publication, How We Take Action, Social Justice in Language Classroom, Words and Actions, excuse me, Social Justice. How We Take Action is my edited volume that's here. But the one here at the bottom, the Me Bridge, this is from Florida International University, I believe. They got a grant to do an entire curriculum centering Blackness for Spanish 1, and they're currently working on Spanish 2, and it's all open access. And so even if you don't teach Spanish, it might be good to click there, and you might get ideas that you can use in other classes. And yes, I forgot to mention, they are presenting here today on that curriculum as well. So +1, I'm a fan, and so I always include it in my presentations. And then just thinking about future directions, I'm optimistic, and I definitely see the pendulum swinging toward more justice-centered language education. I think we need more empirical work conducted in the classroom. And I also think that that we need to be strong in pushing back against some of the policy that is making it difficult to naturally implement this in the classroom. People are frankly scared to do some of these things in certain states and certain contexts, and I think that's unfortunate. Can you imagine, as a Black person, me hearing someone say, I can't teach about this in my classroom because I'll get in trouble. And I'm like, well, you don't go through that thought process when you teach about white people, and that's just unfortunate. Again, not really blaming teachers, just speaking about how unfortunate the times that we're living in are. I'm a part of many blogs on and groups online, and I know teachers mean well, but they'll say, I'm looking for a resource on this particular topic, nothing controversial, and when I see that nothing controversial, I interpret that to mean, okay, they probably mean nothing that talks about gay people or Black people or Indigenous people. And so it's unfortunate. So I think as to the extent possible, if we can be ambassadors, if we can show people how this looks in the classroom, if we can highlight the transformative processes that students go through as they're engaging in this work, that will be helpful for this field moving forward. And so I'll leave it open now for discussion and questions. And Claudia, I don't know how you want to do this.
Yes, thank you very much, LJ. That's fantastic as usual. So I have one question, a very early question, and from Drao Faye, and this person says, how translanguaging pedagogy can fit in this social linguistic justice diagram?
Yes, it definitely does. And that was not sort of an all-inclusive list. And I think maybe I briefly mentioning how I encourage students to translanguage in the classroom as I was presenting, because I do think that's empowering, it's creative use of the language. It reflects how language is actually used in real life context, and not only encouraging my students to engage in that, but also incorporating resources that that use translanguaging when I'm talking about some of these topics, when I'm sharing about people's experiences.
Fantastic. So Chiara Fabian asks, I love the questions for each chapter in the book. How do you change/edit activities in the textbook to make sure that they address those questions? And what kind of activities do you create yourself? I would love to see an example.
Sure. If I were giving like a workshop, I have examples of how I go through what an entire lesson might look like. And if I can quickly find it online, I know I made a blog post about the Nicolas Guillen one, and I'll put that in the link, but that person can also feel free to reach out to me. But in general, what I do is, I create a lot of my own materials that I use in class, and all of those assessments that you saw, those are things that I created because they're not from the textbook. But in terms of like the grammar practice and like the language function practice and practice with getting input using those vocabulary words, I do use the textbook for that. They do a lot of that work outside of class, or I will combine something from the textbook, like a reading, with another reading that offers a counterpoint, or that offers something from about that same topic from a minoritized or marginalized perspective. And when I say reading, it can be something very brief, like an Instagram post, or a short blog post or something like that. So that's one way that I do that, and I connect it to what they are using in the textbook.
Yeah. Okay. Fantastic. Are there any other questions? I see some comments in the chat, but I don't see questions per se. Let's see. I think Drao, the first person that asked a question, says, I'm also curious about the factors that explain the low level of students in modern languages, French, Spanish, etc., in the US. Does it relate to the curriculum, orientation, or teaching approaches? Most learners will say something. I don't know if
can people unmute themselves? I see.
Thank you so much. Actually, I was writing and I saw that you were just finishing your intervention, and then I just sent it this way. Actually, I am teaching here in the US as a graduate student, and I'm teaching pedagogy because I'm teaching how, student teachers, how to teach multilingual learners. And most of the time when I happen to ask them if they have learned, they understand Spanish, because that is most of the students, multilingual students, language heritage. When I ask them, they say that, oh, they learned Spanish in high school or in middle school, but they can't even say good morning. So I'm really curious about this, because I am from Senegal, where we were taught in French, because French is our colonial language, and we were taught in French. We learned English, we learned Spanish, we learned many languages. But at least at the end of the program, students can at least say something about the language which is comprehensible. But why is it that in the US, students barely keep on their level? I'm curious about, is it about the teaching methodology? Is it about the orientation of learning those languages? For example, maybe they are just learning it for the purpose of completing a grade, or they are learning it for a long-term purpose. I'm really curious about that, because I can't understand why someone learned a language, even though it is just 1 year, but not being able to keep at least something that shows that this one has learned the language. Thank you.
Right. And I know that folks like Claudia and Florencia have a lot to say about that and about our teaching methodologies. And I think a lot of that is because, unfortunately, we're using it in many K through 12 schools. And I see this, and, teachers are well-meaning, but I think a lot of times teachers teach how they were taught and in ways that were successful for them. And that means that they are using sort of grammar syllabus approach, and they focus on memorization. And so because of that, many students they don't develop any type of real proficiency in the language. And Kieran, please correct me if I pronounce your name incorrectly.
Yeah.
I experienced that as well. I'm a high school, that's my background. I taught high school for 10 years. And so I get that. And just like what resources are available? What do you have time to actually plan? And, how do you collaborate with other folks? There are lots of sort of systemic barriers to that. And so I think that is unfortunate. But even with that, I think also when students are engaged and they're studying topics that are interesting, and I think justice-centered pedagogies can help them do that, they engage more, and they see language learning as more meaningful, and they see it as something that generates community and that helps them connect to community. And so it's not just something that you're studying because one day you might study abroad, or one day you might have a job where you need to be multilingual. And so I think those elements are important as well. And that's part of the research. If the folks who did the MeBridge curriculum share about their research, that's part of the research that led to that curriculum. They asked Black students, why are you learning a language? What do you want to get from this? And most of the responses related to things of community building. So I think that's an important shift that we should make in our profession. And Mary Ellen, you had your hand up.
Hi, yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Randolph Jr., for your presentation.
And please, y'all call me LJ.
Okay. Well, thank you, LJ, for your presentation. You mentioned at the beginning this idea of one of the places of resistance will sometimes come from this idea of, well, this isn't really applicable to the language communities, or something that the idea of race. And so I'm wondering, both on a theoretical and practical level, what kind of value do you see in maybe talking about the fact that race, and therefore like racism and racial discrimination, is not conceptualized the same across different contexts? So like a US American understanding of race is very contextually specific, and aspects of that, are going to not necessarily apply in other contexts. And then maybe also the idea of combining racism with other forms of discrimination and how that might crop up in target language communities.
Mm-hmm. So if I understand your question correctly, the first thing that popped in my mind when you were talking about this was the study abroad programs that I directed in the Dominican Republic. And I think, if you want to understand nuance of race, that's definitely an interesting context to look at that, how it's like really socially constructed. Everywhere is socially constructed, but I think the nuances there are interesting to look at. And I try to have my students, again, let the resources speak for themselves, and use those resources and the way that people talk about their own identities to drive the discussion versus the labels that we put on other people. And so I think that's the most interesting piece of it. And then there are intersections with other identities. The first thing that popped in my mind, with Puerto Rico, we look at activism from trans communities there, especially after the death of Alexa Morena, I believe her name was, who was a trans woman who was who was murdered in Puerto Rico, and it sparked a lot of community activism. And a lot of those folks, they themselves talk about the intersection of their gender identity as well as their racial identity. So it's not even something that I, as an educator, try to impose on the conversation. It's like that's what people are talking about. And when you incorporate these resources in the class and you let the resources speak for themselves, I think that's kind of naturally where the conversation leads. And I think that touches on I forgot whose question it was. Fillmore's question about how do you avoid being too preachy in the classroom. And I think it's about letting the resources speak for themselves, and then also asking a lot of how and why questions versus do you agree with or is this person right type questions.
Thank you.
Yes.
So we might have time for one last question from Mika. And this person says, I'm curious about what steps you would take to make sure that students do not end up stereotyping Latin America if we always focus on social issues, especially if we are speaking to them fully in Spanish. I fear that they would not understand enough or not be able to communicate enough to lead to a deep conversation. Instead, I worry that I would be stereotypical and surface level.
Excellent question, Micah. And the biggest piece of advice I can give for that is to ignore political boundaries. Focus on communities. I try to focus on the smallest community entity as possible. And so with that lesson, for example, I focus on the small group of individuals who are from Southern California. And even within that small group, they all have very different perspectives and ways that they interpret their identities. And so my students couldn't walk away from that lesson saying, oh, this is what Black Mexican people think, or this is like best activism. Demographics of that community are vastly different from the demographics of Puerto Rico as a whole. And so I always try to ignore political boundaries when I do these types of things so that students don't develop stereotypes. I think that might answer some of your question. And then also making sure that you leave space for that deeper critical reflection in whatever language the students choose, whether it be that Spanish in this case, or English, or they want to engage in translanguaging, making sure that you leave space for some of that unpacking to occur. And again, that can be done outside of class via discussion board. And then as an educator, you can see how students are interacting with it, how they're thinking about it. Via the self-assessments that we do at the end of every unit, I can see how students are thinking about these issues. And so I'm able to identify, there are many spaces where I'm communicating with my students where I'm able to see, okay, oh wait, they're forming this idea about this community that I did not mean to, I did not mean for them to get from that. That's something that I need to address. And so just making sure that you're creating spaces for that type of thinking and reflection to occur, both with the students and yourself as an educator.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I will pass you the chat if you want, LJ, just to see if you want to address some other comments that we have not had time to address. But thank you so much. Thank you so much. This has been so inspiring. It is always an honor to have you, LJ. And for the rest of you, if you want to stay in room A, this is the link, so you can stay. We're going to take a 10-minute break, and we're going to start the next sessions at 10:45 Central. And then otherwise you should leave this meeting and start with the other one, the other links, Zoom link and room B. So thank you so much, LJ, and
thank you so much for having me. And if I just may, on this slide, I have my contact information. It's basically proferandolph@gmail. And then if I'm on social media, my tag would be proferandolph. And then there's a link to all of the slides here. It's just tinyurl.com/SOPHE2023.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you. Good trips to Chicago. Okay, so Muriel, if this is you now, I'm gonna leave to the other room, okay?
Okay. You have to make me. I'm not host. Yeah.
Okay, so let me do it here, from here.
Podemos hablar en español porque total ya no es parte oficial. Thank you, LJ.
Bye-bye,
We
LJ.
appreciate it.
So let's
Thanks again for having me. All right.
Bye-bye.
Muchas gracias. Un
Bye-bye,
honor.
LJ.
Igualmente, gracias. Que tengan un
Bye-bye.
buen fin de semana.
Adiós.
Have a good weekend,
Gracias.
everyone.
Espérame, Muriel, un segundito, por favor.
Okay.
So let's see. Me voy a, let's see what I can do. It's because I am dealing with two accounts here. So me voy a salir de aquí, ¿ok? Y voy a volver a entrar.
Ok. Bueno.